all these things that I care about, that I thought, you know, these are things that are happening in my neighborhood, and you're not going to find them at City Hall. You're just, you know, you need to listen. You really need to have your ear to the ground, I think is an expression that people use. And you do it by talking to people and asking people questions. So I bet everybody in this classroom has at least one news story that I could write probably for tomorrow's paper. You know, it's just, I know how to get at those things because I've had years of experience, but there's really a lot of interesting stuff. Some of it might take a little longer than a day to write. But you know, you're involved in sports, you're involved in wonderful volunteer work and service, you're involved in all kinds of different things. Those are all really interesting. People would like to read about that stuff. How come we don't see ourselves more in the newspaper? Okay, so what elements or values do journalists look for in deciding what is news? Because there's a ton of stuff out there and you actually cannot write about all of it. One of them, and we talked about the ones that have influenced elections. Now I'm going to give you the complete list because there are people who actually study this, and there's been a whole bunch of studies done about what are the reporters' values? What are they looking for? So one of them is, who is your audience? Who are you writing for? If you're writing for Cleveland, you're going to write a whole bunch of stories about Cleveland. We're going to care more about the Cavs than people anywhere else, right? So anytime LeBron sneezes, we get a story. When I first moved to Cleveland, I remember, you know, back in, I guess it was it as far back as 2006? LeBron was starting to become a phenomenon. And every day there was a LeBron story, not just in the paper, but on the front page. Every time he turned around, they wrote something about it. So these are Cleveland stories. We get them all year, right? But people elsewhere get LeBron stories when it's championship time. But not so much all the time. Okay, so it depends what your audience is. The impact. If a lot of people are affected by a story, it's going to be more interesting than if a few people are. Or if the impact is possibly fatal. That's why there was all that attention paid to Ebola, because it spreads very easily and it's fatal and quick. But also the Zika virus, all the scare stuff that we get, people want you to know about that. You know, journalists think it's really important for people to know. So we have a lot of stuff about the Zika virus, even though there's really very few people in the United States who've actually gotten bitten by or actually developed the syndrome that goes with the Zika virus. Okay. Proximity. How close to home is it? We really do care about how close to home stories are. We're going to be much more interested in stuff that's closer to us. This is why we almost never, not almost never, we're starting to hear more news about foreign countries now. I really think people have demonstrated an actual interest in foreign stories and in foreign news coverage, and it's easier for people to actually get that coverage because of modern communication. So, yeah.
Could you argue that that's only happening because of its effects on us here? So in a way,
yeah, we're most interested in how does that country affect us.
Because immediately when you said, I thought Brexit. And
yeah, yeah. Right, we care about Brexit in relation to the United States. We'll often have that angle. But there are many people who are now reading The Guardian. You know, they're reading the British, they're listening to or watching the BBC. They want to know, what do the Brits think about Brexit? And they can actually do that. They can actually, you know, you can get that news if you want it. And so there's a lot more foreign news than there was even 20 years ago. It's amazing. And I'm very pleased to see it because Americans used to be kind of unique in their lack of interest in the rest of the world. Well, maybe not unique. The Chinese are known for that too. Okay, timeliness. Is it new? We tend to get pretty excited about what is new. And we want to break the story first. This is a journalism thing. Prominence. Does it involve somebody famous? That's one of those election news values too. Novelty, is it unusual? The biggest, the longest, the first, the biggest zucchini, the biggest pumpkin, you know, who ran the fastest? Sports is just full of all of this stuff about who did the best, who set a world record, all that kind of stuff. Conflict. We're very fond of conflict. People get very tired of reading about all the conflict in the world, and sometimes they turn off the news for that reason. However, it is important for us to cover it. It's just that it tends often to take precedence over all kinds of other news, and we rarely offer solutions for all these things. So we're trying to do better on that. I still consider myself a journalist. I think it's one of those callings that you are a journalist as opposed to you do journalism, and so I still think that way. Okay, another thing that we always have to take into consideration is, are other media covering the story? For some reason, if other media are covering the story, we also want to cover the story, which has been a long-standing thing. We want our readers, viewers, etc., not to read and view any of those other things, those competing publications. So we will all have somebody at the White House, which is absurd. We will all have somebody covering, this or that or the other thing, and so journalists tend to be in packs. Yeah. Is there public reaction to the story, or is it likely that there will be? This is a very important consideration. The best days, how many of you have seen Spotlight? The movie Spotlight. Okay, at the end of the movie, what happens at the very end of the movie? Does anybody remember how it ends? Julie?
Doesn't the Spotlight office get a bunch of phone calls from other victims?
Yeah, they sure do. The phones are ringing off the hook. Those are the best days in journalism. You know that a story means something to people, that people care about it, that you've hit a nerve, and that maybe there are more stories related to that when the phones ring off the hook. When you write a story that generates that kind of interest, those are your best days as a journalist. Yeah. Types of stories. Hard news stories are factual, time-sensitive, and I'm not sure why they're called hard news as opposed to soft news, but there used to be a rule, an unwritten rule in journalism that only men could write hard news and that women wrote soft news. And so I think that was why when I went into journalism, it was difficult for a woman to get to cover hard news, but I insisted on it. I think I was one of the first women in my newsroom to combine covering hard news and having it be like City Hall with having children. It's a challenge. You have to go immediately. It's when something happens, you have to write it right away. You have to be there. You have to think of all the questions right away. And if you don't do it right away, it doesn't stand up over time. It's not, it's instant stuff. You have to get it right away. Soft news is stuff that it's feature stories, it's that, nice stuff about human interest. I just saw a movie really recently, what's it called, Philomena? It has Judi Dench in it. She's playing a British woman who's looking for her son, who she gave up for adoption years ago. And the guy who gets to cover this story is a former Washington correspondent for the BBC or something. And he thinks this is a really boring story. This is soft news, it's not his thing. But he's out of a job, and so he decides he's going to cover this. It turns out it's like the best story he ever covered. It's really, really good. She finds out who her son is, and it's really interesting. But it takes time, and it doesn't have to be published right away. It's not something that just happened that you have to tell the world about right away. It's usually some long unfolding thing that takes a while to investigate. And it has color. It has this human interest stuff. And in the Brits, in this movie, it's a British movie, it has Judi Dench in it. They call it a human interest story rather than soft news, but he's just as disparaging about it as American reporters are about soft news. So I love writing features, and features can also be sort of a hard news story. So you're going to write features if you're in the communication side of this course, about the convention, which is sort of halfway between hard news and soft news, because you really do have to publish it right away. It is about events that are happening, but it takes a more analytical approach. So we're calling them features, but they're sort of in the hard news category. Okay, but you can write a human interest story from the convention, and this could be a very good thing. Say you find, if you go out there and you find a really interesting person who is maybe a food vendor who's working during the convention, and you decide you're going to do a day in the life of a food vendor, right? Wow, that could be really interesting. That's journalism. It's good journalism. So think about doing something like that. Okay, so the feature and the profile, those are types of features. A profile is about a person. There are some people who use that term somewhat differently, but this is the way I use it. Okay? Who is a reporter? Okay, now we get into, this is actually one of the central questions in journalism today. Who qualifies as a reporter? And this is the old definition, and it is changing. They're trying to write some stuff, what do they call it, so that people can keep shield laws. The shield law keeps not getting passed through Congress, partly because they're stuck on the definition of who is a journalist. And I once, in an article, actually printed the current definition of, from the shield law of that moment, of what a journalist is. And it's about this long, in small type, because there are so many different things. Because now, not everybody works for a mainstream media organization who is a journalist. Many citizen journalists, bloggers, people who cover things on Twitter, people who work for online-only organizations, people who are, excuse me, freelancers, excuse me, freelancers are a big part of the journalism world today, because so many people got laid off from mainstream media, but they still need stories. So there's people who are working freelance, and that means you're on your own, and they just pay you per story. Okay, so it used to be that they kept very close tabs on who got to be a reporter. You had to sort of, jump through a number of hoops. It was professionalized during the mid-20th century. So in the early 20th century, journalists were considered scum. When I told my mother I wanted to be a journalist, and this was in the mid-20th century, my mother was scandalized. She said, "My God, that's certainly not for a woman. I mean, you couldn't possibly want to do that." And yeah, that made me even more determined to do it, of course. Today we are seeing the rise of citizen journalists, untrained people, and so now I want to know what you think. Do you think it's a good or a bad thing that we have all these different media and all these different types of journalists? Julie?
I think that it's good that more people, like citizens, are writing journalism, because it gets a lot of different perspectives, and rather than mainstream media just choosing one viewpoint and kind of broadcasting it to everyone, we get to see everyone's opinions and everyone's viewpoints, and I
Right.
think that's better.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that would be a pro, but there's also a con to it, that you see so many people with opinions that are far-fetched, and sometimes you wonder why is that even like out there, like things that people are sharing, like is that
Yeah.
shouldn't be, like that's when you think maybe there should be a standard of who should be a reporter.
Yeah. Yeah, and many of them don't know how to do journalism, so the stuff is not verified. We're going to get to some of the principles of journalism, and everybody who's taken a journalism class from me knows that the discipline of verification is very important to me. It's the essence of what journalists do. You have to verify stuff. I have a rap. I will do it at some point. So what do we mean by the media? We did talk about this yesterday, so we can go through this really quickly. There's all kinds of different media. So there's news media, and we talked about that yesterday, but we didn't talk about all the other types of media. We are surrounded by media from the moment we're born. Even your t-shirt has messages on it. Anything that has a message is a medium. So you can write stuff on a t-shirt, you can write stuff on a wall, you can write stuff on a billboard, you can put it on TV, you can put it on the radio, anything that has a message. And the medium is the thing that carries the message, okay? So there's print, there's broadcast, there's movies, there's TV, there's radio, there's all these different things. I'm getting all mixed up. Yeah. Music. Music is a very important medium. People take those words very seriously in songs, and that's important to remember. Each medium is something between the audience and the news or whatever the message is, okay? So when taken together, we tend to think of those things as the media, but in fact, somebody is writing those messages. Somebody is constructing those messages. Remember Gay Tuckman and the stuff I talked about. Remember that somebody actually wrote that message, and it doesn't necessarily represent all of reality. And sometimes it's not even true. Sometimes it's just their idea of what happened or what is true, and they haven't actually verified it. Okay, so we talk about the people who write the news, or the people who work in media as the media as well. So I've often had people say in disparaging tones, okay, all of you media, go over there. You know, this is what they do to us when we're out there covering stories. They make us stand in a certain place. Sometimes there's even a barrier so that we can't, you know, go and talk to everybody. It's very distressing. Okay, that's the end of my lecture for today. Any other comments, questions, things that weren't that clear? You think you understand what news is now? You might have thought you understood what news was before, and you might have been perfectly happy with the knowledge that you had, but this is a way of opening a few windows for you that maybe you hadn't thought about before. Okay, good. I'm going to turn off the camera, but Colin, are you coming right up to do your lecture, or are we going to have a break?
I think we have breaking your store class stuff. I think we'll do next.
Right, should I do that? We'll do that, and then you'll do your lecture. So we're going to turn the camera off if you want to press the red button or whatever.